Hi, this is Chris Young, and welcome to episode 21 of Contemplating Life. Although it's embarrassing to admit it, my storytelling techniques were influenced by Bill Cosby. Now, I don't want to be associated with him because I now know what a horrible human being he is. I no longer brag that we share the same birthday, July 12th. I still admire his ability as a storyteller. When he tells this famous story of his friend Fat Albert, he tells a lengthy tale simply to illustrate how fat Fat Albert was. Then he lets out a sigh and says,
Now, I told you that story to tell you this one.
"Okay, I told you that story, so I can tell you this one." And then he tells the Fat Albert story that he wanted to tell to begin with. I find myself using that technique a lot. I can't tell you one story until I tell you the one before that. And I can't tell you that one until the one before that. So there's a lot of, I told you that story so I can tell you this one, in this episode. And you've probably already seen that in previous episodes, and you'll continue to see it in future ones. It's how I remember things. I have to have context. It's the way I think. Therefore, it's the way I write. So, in 1986, I wrote an autobiographical magazine feature about my experiences in that special ed school. The article titled "The Reunion" was a reflection prompted by an all-school reunion of Indianapolis Public Schools number 97, James E. Roberts School for the Handicapped. The reunion, the event, not the story, was to commemorate the closing of the school. The article was published in the September 1987 issue of Indianapolis Monthly Magazine, and it was awarded Best Magazine Feature by the Indiana chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, Sigma Delta Chi. My plan for next week is to read that article for you. That's the story I want to tell. But before I do so, I have to tell you the story behind the story, and the story behind that one, and the story behind that one. And before I could tell you any of these stories, I had to tell you the story of how I tell stories like Bill Cosby did. It's all connected. Okay, so where do I begin to tell this story?
Our whole universe was in a hot, dense state that nearly 14 billion years ago expansion started. Wait.
No, that's maybe too far back. Let's try to get a little closer to the story we want to tell. Set your Wayback Machine to Thursday, May 26, 1983, 3 years and 8 days before the reunion. It was the final day of practice for the Indianapolis 500. And although there haven't been carburetors in Indy cars for many years, they still refer to the day as Carburation Day, or Carb Day for short. I've been a lifelong fan of the Indy 500. I almost started telling you a long story about how I'm a race fan, but let's cut that one out and save it for a future episode. Let's just say it all started on Carb Day 1983. The practice session only lasts about 2 hours in the late morning, rather than all day for most practice days. Mom attended with me, and on our way home, I asked her if we could stop by the Radio Shack computer store on Crawfordsville Road. I wanted to see if they had the new Radio Shack Model 100 computer. This revolutionary device was arguably the first true laptop computer. It measured 300 by 215 by 55 millimeters, or about 7 3/4 by 8.5 by 2 inches, and it weighed just over 3 pounds. The gray monochrome LCD screen could only display 8 lines of 40 characters each. That seems ridiculous small by today's standards, and it was also small compared to the 16 by 64 characters of the Radio Shack Model 1. However, the only other portable computers in those days were the size of a suitcase and weighed nearly 30 pounds, so this was a real breakthrough. I fell in love with the machine the minute I saw it, and we ended up taking one home that day. Normally, I don't remember the exact day that I purchased a computer. The sales receipt is long gone. But I remember we bought it on the way home from Carb Day. A Google search told me the Model 100 was introduced in April 1983. Wikipedia told me the date at Carb Day for the 83 race. I could have just said I bought it in the spring of 83, but what's the fun in that? I know the exact date I bought the computer. My dad had to disassemble my expensive new toy to wire in some extra buttons so I could operate the control and shift keys. In those days, I would type by poking at the keys with a stick in my right hand. I would hold the push buttons in my left hand to operate the modifier keys. We managed to successfully wire in the microswitches on a cable about 18 inches long. The Model 100 also had a built-in 300 baud modem. Note that baud is the number of bits per second that it transfers. The fastest dial-up internet ever used was 56,000 baud, and today's internet speed is measured in gigabits, or billions of bits per second. So 300 baud was really slow. When I built my first personal computer, I had a modem that I used for connecting to the IUPUI mainframe DEC System 10 computer. But in 1983, I had already left my job working for the Indiana University Department of Medical Genetics, and I didn't have much use for a modem. The Model 100 from Radio Shack became an instant hit with journalists. The following year, when I was at the Speedway, I was hanging out with some reporters in the press room. Many of them were writing their stories using the device and then uploading them directly to their newspaper or wire service. Model 100 included the famous CompuServe Snap Pack. The Snap Pack was a sign-up kit for the CompuServe Information Service. It consisted of a small envelope that you could rip off the perforated end and snap it open. Inside, you would find an account number and a password to sign up for the online service. CompuServe was hosted on a network of DEC System 10 mainframes, like the one we had at IUPUI. Your account number was called a PPN, which stood for Project Programmer Number. It was two numbers separated by a comma. I still remember mine. It was 70136, 62. It was not only your account number, but it was your email address as well. Although technically the Internet was born in January 1983, very few people used it outside of military and universities. Commercial Internet providers didn't appear until around 1989 or so. So CompuServe was the first consumer online information service. Now, there were a few private bulletin board systems, known as BBS, that people would connect to. CompuServe was followed by services such as Prodigy and AOL, but all of this predated the public use of the Internet. I don't know for certain when I finally opened up that Snap Pack and signed into CompuServe for the first time, but I'm thinking it wasn't until the fall of 1983. CompuServe was completely text-based. It offered email and real-time chat rooms, known as CB rooms, named after a citizens band radio. You could use a nickname that was referred to as a handle, also patterned after CB radio lingo. CompuServe also offered discussion forums, or so-called SIGs, or special interest groups. You could also read news articles, get weather reports, sports scores, stock updates, and book airline tickets. It featured many of the things that we do with the Internet today, as long as it didn't involve images, video, or audio. By the way, In 1987, CompuServe invented the graphics interchange format, or GIF files, that we still use today. They updated the specification in 1989 to allow for animation, but this was still back in 1983, so there were no online graphics. I'll have more to talk about my use of graphics on CompuServe in later episodes. There were local telephone numbers in major cities that you could dial up to connect to the service. However, it was quite expensive. You were billed about $6 per hour, or that comes out to 10 cents per minute. Running at 300 baud, that could add up very quickly. I gravitated towards a SIG, or Special Interest Group, known as NIPSIG, which stood for National Information Providers Special Interest Group. It was a gathering place for newspaper people who kept the news pages updated. However, over time, it evolved into a place where people discussed various issues of the day. It was eventually renamed the Issues Forum. I ended up there because they had a section called Handicapped Issues. Not only did I participate in that subsection on a variety of disability-related issues, but in the other sections of the Issues Forum, I also discussed politics, religion, and other topics. Each SIG was managed by a system operator, or SysOp for short. The SysOp of Issues Forum was an amazing woman named Georgia Griffith. She was blind, I believe for most of her life, if not from birth. She accessed CompuServe using a Braille terminal that would display one line of text as a series of raised bumps in Braille format. She had been a music teacher for much of her life, but had retired from that work and now worked at the Library of Congress transcribing music into Braille. She had a special device she would drag across the musical score, and it would create a raised shape of the music staff and notes that she could feel with her finger. I was amazed by the technology. It was only after I knew her for several months that I learned she was also deaf. She lost her hearing late in life. I took the news pretty hard. I think it was probably the only time in my life that I really felt sorry for someone regarding their disability. I couldn't imagine what it was like to be blind, to build your life around music, and then to later lose your hearing. I took it as a tragic loss for a dear friend. I had to remind myself that she had gone deaf long before I first met her. She was the same person I always knew, yet I had no idea who she really was. Her second disability was completely hidden from me. And of course, I wouldn't have known she was blind had she not told me. I had already learned that communicating with people online was a great equalizer. It may sound trite or cliche, but communicating online allows you to connect mind to mind without any physical characteristics coming into play. My first realization of this phenomena was when I was talking one-on-one with a woman whose online name was Daria Dene. At one point she simply asked, "Looks?" wondering what I looked like. I kind of freaked out because I realized it was the first time in my life in a social situation when someone didn't know I had a disability. I don't recall exactly what happened, but I think I just disconnected. I wrote about the experience later in the Handicapped Issues forum. A columnist who worked on CompuServe wrote an article about me online about the experience. In some ways, it was liberating to be completely free of my disability. On the other hand, I discovered that hiding my disability was hiding my true self. I've had plenty of opportunities in the decades since then, either on CompuServe or on the internet, where I had the opportunity to keep my disability a secret, and it just didn't feel right. While participating in the Issues Forum, I drew the attention of a woman named Pamela Bowen. She was the city editor of the Huntington, West Virginia Herald-Dispatch newspaper. Her husband, Charlie, also worked for the newspaper, and they both worked as information providers for CompuServe. Charlie wrote a book called How to Get the Most Out of CompuServe, and it was very popular. She told me both publicly and privately that she thought I was a talented writer. We began exchanging lengthy emails with each other, and over the next months and even years, we told each other our life stories. My emails to her became a kind of personal journal in which I shared my innermost thoughts. We became extremely close friends. It was amazing the bond that developed between us. Unfortunately for me, and fortunately for her, she is very happy in her marriage. If not for the strength of her relationship with her husband, I'm confident we would have been even closer. My letters to Pamela provided me with a kind of therapeutic value of a personal journal, with the added bonus that I knew someone was out there reading what I was writing and appreciating it. At the time, the word blog had not yet been invented. Essentially, that's what I was writing. It was a personal blog about my life with an audience of one. On several occasions, my mother said that she was going to collect all those emails that I'd written to Pamela and publish them as my biography. My response was, over my dead body. And she said, yeah, matter of fact, exactly. That's what I'll do. When you die, I'm going to publish your works. In those days, I had no idea that I would possibly outlive my mother. Because CompuServe became prohibitively expensive for me, I had to find a workaround. A SysOp had the authority to grant a free flag to members who contributed to the discussion groups. Eventually, I became the discussion leader of the Handicap Issues section. That would give me free access as long as I was logged into the Issues forum. If I logged in and quickly moved to that group, I would only be charged a few cents each time I entered and exited. However, writing emails was costly. Even if I found a way to compose them offline and upload them at the extremely low baud rates, it was still expensive. Pamela was so committed to our continuing correspondence that she shared with me the account number and password to a somewhat secret file transfer area that was used by the content providers. I would log into her account and upload a file with a name such as PB071285, which meant it was a letter to PB on July 12, 1985. When she had read the message, she would delete it from the directory, so I knew she had read it. Then she would leave me a reply with something like CY071385 the following day. I eventually migrated from the Issues Forum to another popular feature on CompuServe, Human Sexuality Support Groups, with the online address HSX. It was operated by noted authors and sex educators Howard and Martha Lewis. I believe they had written a sex education book for high school curriculum. On CompuServe, they had a series of pages of information about human sexuality, as well as a lively discussion forum. Eventually, I was recruited by them to start a handicapped sexuality section on their forum. The group wasn't much of a success. I believe we attracted less than 10 participants, and once we had each shared as much about our romantic successes and failures as we cared to do, it kind of went quiet and we eventually dissolved the group. Howard appreciated my skill as a writer and suggested I start a section of personal reflections about my life with a disability. He came up with the name Sighs Eye on Life. If you listen to the first episode of this podcast, I explained that I nearly called this podcast by that name, but it's a very confusing phrase to listen to. In case you don't understand what I'm saying, it's my initials, CY, apostrophe S, I as in eyeball, on life. Sighs Eye on Life. So, I told you those stories so I could tell you this one. In early 1986, I received a small, hand-addressed envelope containing an invitation that read, "You were invited to an open house at James E. Roberts Public School number 97 from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. on May 18, 1986, commemorating 50 years of educating handicapped students in Indianapolis, and on the occasion of the closing of James E. Roberts School." I attended that open house, and it brought back many emotional memories of my 13 years attending the school. After the event, I began writing a series of messages in the HSX forum in my Sighs Eye on Life subsection. The series got rave reviews, not only from professional writers like my friend Pamela, but from many other people. I printed out copies of the messages and shared them with friends and family who didn't have access to CompuServe. That also brought rave reviews. Many people strongly encouraged me to submit it somewhere for publication, but I didn't have any interest in doing that. Writing the stories was a catharsis for me. I wanted to get those feelings out of my system and put it all behind me. I didn't want to have anything more to do with it once it was written. One day, I was watching the noon news. There was an interview with a woman named Deborah Paul. She was the editor of Indianapolis Monthly Magazine. She said something I'll never forget. She said, "I feel like an experience is incomplete until I've written about it." That precisely described my feeling about my writing. I need to write about things to put my experiences in perspective. I concluded that if this was the way she felt about writing, perhaps she would be open to publishing my work. If they liked it, great. If they didn't, it would get all my friends and family off my back because I could say, hey, at least I tried. I took the series of messages I had written and compiled them together into a single narrative. I submitted it to the magazine. In the topping letter, I mentioned what I heard Ms. Paul say in that interview about why she wrote and about how I felt the same way. I don't know if I told her that it was based on something I had written on CompuServe. These days, that would have been a deal breaker. If you put something on the internet, especially free to the public, no one will buy your publishing rights. If it was behind a paywall, such as Patreon subscribers, you might get away with it, or at least they would consider it as a so-called reprint. But in those days, nobody cared anything about online publishing. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten note from Ms. Paul. She said she was going to write me a quick thank you rejection letter when she started reading what I'd written and couldn't put it down. She wasn't sure what to do with it because it's not the kind of thing they usually publish. She said she showed it to some of her associate editors, and they didn't know what to do with it either. She asked if I would give them a couple of weeks, and they would get back to me. I did hear back in about 2 weeks, in the form of a phone call. She said they wanted to publish my story, but there were 3 problems. 1, they never published anything written in first person. 2, it doesn't fit the format of the magazine. 3, it's too long. Then she said, I got to thinking, wait a minute. Just because we never published a first-person feature before doesn't mean we can't start now. And I'm the editor of this magazine, and I decide what is or is not our format. That leaves number 3. It's still too long. She gave me the option of giving me the story back again, allowing me to try to sell it somewhere else intact, or to have them publish a shorter version. She said, Chris, you've put your soul on paper, but unfortunately, we only want half of your soul. We both laughed. When I told a friend about that, they said it reminded them of the line from the movie Amadeus, where they told Mozart his music had too many notes. She said, I respect the fact that this is a very personal story to you. So I want to give you the opportunity to submit a shorter version yourself. Or if you prefer, I can just edit it. After all, that's my job as editor. I edit. I was happy to have the opportunity to resubmit a shorter version. As you might imagine, cutting your soul in two is no easy task. Writers never want their work cut, but I was so happy that they wanted to publish it, I didn't care. I resubmitted a shorter version of the story. The final version that appeared in the magazine had about 5 or 6 more paragraphs cut from my resubmission, but a couple of paragraphs that I cut out were put back in. I was very happy with the final result. I don't recall when I submitted the article or when it was accepted. It must have been late 1985 or early 1986, because she warned me they would be holding it until the September 87 issue, since it was school-related. It would be a kind of back-to-school feature. Somewhere along the way, we made arrangements to go back to Robert's school to take some photos to accompany the piece. We also shot a photo of me in my home office, and I supplied them with an 8th grade class photo. I don't recall what I was paid for the work, but it was whatever the usual rates were. As the author, I also received a complimentary copy of the magazine. I wasn't a subscriber. We also found out who was the distributor, and my mom went directly to them and purchased about 10 copies, so that we wouldn't deplete the newsstand copies. I still have a couple of copies, but I've given most of them away. The response was phenomenal. I'll talk more about what happened after the article appeared, but I think it's time to wrap things up for today. I haven't decided yet if I'll read it in 1 or 2 installments. In the episode following that, I'll talk about what happened afterwards. I already mentioned that it received the top award in its category. More on that later. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and any other benefits I might come up with down the road. It's not that I'm desperate for money, but a little extra income sure could help. Well, actually, right now I am desperate for money. We just had a big plumbing bill come in. But $5 a month isn't going to put a dent in that. So let's just say, don't feel guilty if you don't subscribe, but if you want to show me your appreciation, please do. Many thanks to my existing Patreon supporters. Your support means to me more than words can possibly express. Even if you can't provide financial support, I'm begging, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. Tell all your friends and family. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.